the importance of empathy and the importance of cooperation in order for group survival, and then the need to create some sort of top-down control over groups, because there's tension between our instinctive drives and maybe our variations in temperament, and being able to cooperate and have empathy for one another and sort of not transgress the rules of the tribe. That ends up coalescing into this idea that there is an invisible parent who dictates how you are to behave, who will be angry with you if you don't do what we're telling you to do, if you don't overcome your animalistic instincts.
Hey guys, I am live with Julian Walker, who is the third pillar, the third part of the trifecta behind the Conspirituality Podcast. I've had Derek Beres on the podcast before. We talked about QAnon and cult-like behavior in yoga. We've had Matthew Remski on. That was episode 297. I think Derek was 291. And now we've got Julian. Julian, thank you so much for joining us. It's you guys are doing amazing work on the Conspirituality Podcast. I was saying before we started, I'm going to say it again. I get a lot of feedback from people saying, thank God there's one person out there. It makes me not feel like I'm going crazy. I'm sure you guys hear the same thing all the time. We
do hear it, and we always appreciate it. Thank you so much. It's great to be here with you.
Yeah. So you guys are obviously, it's mostly a commentary on sort of the wellness space, the yoga space, the meditation space. And I know we've covered this on the podcast before, but my audience is pretty well aware of how deeply embedded things like, conspiracy theory, anti-vax, anti-mask, COVID denialism, conspiracy theory is embedded in the jiu-jitsu space and in the mixed martial arts space now. But you guys are seeing the same thing in sort of the, the more historically left-wing, soft, not super macho spaces as well, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's so interesting that it's showing up in both spaces. I'm actually really curious to hear more about that from you. I think, we noticed at the beginning of the pandemic that there was just a huge uptick on our social media feeds of everyone from, yoga teachers to like women's empowerment coaches to people who claim to be energy healers, all putting out COVID denialism. 5G is really what's causing the COVID symptoms, and it's all just a big plot to take away our freedoms. And that started, as soon as the quarantine measures began. And it made us really curious, like, what is going on here? How does it track with the kinds of stuff that all three of us had been observing within that broader community for many years? And it's, we thought we'd do one podcast episode just sort of chatting about it on Derek's podcast. And then we did a second one. And then for the third one, he said, let's start our own thing. And now we're, I think we do episode 63 tomorrow. So there's been an endless deluge of topics and content and characters to talk about.
Yeah. I sometimes wonder if sort of 90% of the answer as to why certain influencers have gone one way and certain influencers have gone the other way is really how much did this cut into their bottom line? I mean, the thing that the most hardcore MMA gym and the most esoteric yoga studio have in common is that both of them, during the peak of the quarantine measures, were unable to operate. And thus both of those groups went skittering to the internet to find any theory, to find any rationalization for why it's okay to continue making money. Why is it okay to keep on doing what they're doing to essentially pay the bills? And I think maybe it's part of the explanation why, although there's a ton of conspiracy thinking in Canada, it seems much more widespread in the United States. I think the United States is probably the epicenter or ground zero for this kind of conspiracy thinking. And I think maybe there was just less financial support for small businesses. And maybe that explains not all the variation, but a significant amount of the crazy amounts of conspiracy. We'll just lump it, conspiracism in the two communities.
Yeah, I think you're really onto something there. And we know that QAnon has spread to about 71 countries. There was actually research out of Concordia in Canada mentioning that. And the top ones are like Germany, England, and Italy. I think, are the top three after the United States. And I think there is definitely something to the lack of social safety net here, and the fact that, for example, in the yoga and wellness space, most of us are gig workers. Studio owners are, they're completely dependent on weekly income, daily income to keep the thing afloat. Teachers have no benefits. There's no, there are no sick days. There's no health insurance. It's a very, I don't know if living in Canada, people can even grasp the extent to which we are on the tightrope without a net. And that's even more true in the sort of Wild West entrepreneurial space of yoga. And so that's the interesting contradiction that I think people who are just consumers or appreciators, people who show up at their local yoga studio to take a class, even if they do that really consistently, and people who consume the marketing that comes out of the yoga and wellness space, often, and for good reason, like why should they, right? Really think about what's going on behind the scenes. And behind the scenes, it's very much this, gig working, entrepreneurial, libertarian. Because there's no regulation, because it's such a new field, a lot of studio owners kind of get away with having the best of both worlds, where they treat yoga teachers as simultaneously being employees who they can put a lot of have a lot of power over, and limit certain ways in which there are like non-compete clauses and all sorts of different things that corporate yoga companies put in place. But at the same time, you're an independent contractor who has no rights,
no benefits.
No benefits. Yeah. So I think you're right in terms of like a motivated reasoning piece, right? Where oh my God, what's going to happen? I don't want to lose the yoga studio if I'm an owner. I don't want to not be able to pay my bills if you're a teacher. There must be some way that this is bullshit, man, and I'm gonna figure out how to fight back and keep the studio open. I'm gonna do my own research. Exactly. I'm gonna do my own research and step away from the mainstream narrative. But there's another really key piece in there as well, which is, I think, part of what led to us adopting this name, Conspirituality, which is that the more spiritually minded people in the current incarnation, right, like the New Age spiritual incarnation, have always tended to be skeptical of the mainstream narrative, right? There's a counterculture sensibility. There's I'm going to find out deeper, ultimate truths about the universe that you can't learn in universities and that science doesn't understand, right? And I'm going to find these charismatic figures who can sort of zap you with enlightenment, with some sort of, Shaktipat or big moment of non-dual awakening. So that's always been a component. And I think a big part of that too is reliance on alternative medicine practices that have a sort of range of how effective or legitimate they are, as well as being bought in on pseudoscience. And that's where the entrepreneurial piece kicks in as well, right? Because there's a lot of money to be made from snake oil. So we're sort of swimming in these waters where there's all kinds of epistemic confusion about how do you claim what's true and what's false? How do you make sense of whether or not there's scientific evidence for certain things that you really want to believe in? And that all sort of lends itself to this sense of like, well, I don't trust the government and I don't trust big pharma. And I don't know.
I don't trust science. I don't trust universities. Exactly. I trust, to quote Walter Masterson, I trust my friend, who's my roommate, who's a personal trainer and sells doTERRA essential oils on the side.
Exactly. And I trust the sort of intuitive capacity to know absolute truth by being in touch with my heart or by like tuning into the synchronistic signs from the universe. So all of that, I think, then lends itself. It already has overlap with conspiracy thinking, and apply enough pressure, as you're saying, both in terms of the financial piece and the sort of disorienting existential piece. And we were ripe for all of this stuff.
Yeah. I don't think, I'm just trying to jump to the jiu-jitsu MMA community. I don't think there's as much of the, tune in and vibe with the universe aspect of it, but there is a very strong aspect of personal experience. I mean, the thing about jiu-jitsu is that you can go and test something for yourself. If you think that you have a better way to choke me, we can try it. And if you choke the hell out of me and then you go and do it at a tournament and then you see high level guys stealing it and using it, you know that you had something that worked. But so it puts the personal experience and learning through, firsthand experience right at the top of the knowledge hierarchy. So now the number of people who told me early in the pandemic, well, we haven't had a single case at my gym. Well, that's great.
Nice.
I don't know a single person who's died. Well, at that point, not that many people had died.
Yeah.
I don't know a single person who's gotten sick. Again, what does the scientist in me goes, what does your personal experience have to do with any of this when our data is coming from Italy, when our data is coming from
Iran.
China, Iran? That was an early country that just got absolutely nuked. India.
Yep.
That came a bit later. So I think this reliance on, as opposed to personal revelation, personal experience, it does really make one distrustful of all the processes that are in science. I mean, I spent 15 years in biology and doing research in biology, and the idea that there's this red telephone that rings and it's Fauci on the other end going, here's the results that you need to find. I mean, you put 4 scientists in a room, you're going to have 8 opinions.
Yeah. So, and this is the thing with all conspiracy theories, right? They all conspiracy theories that are based in this kind of elaborate, paranoid leaps of reasoning, lack of well evidenced, all based on hunches and like cobbling something together. Because of course there are real conspiracies, and those real conspiracies are exposed through investigative journalism and scientific evidence, and like really coming to find objective facts that, even though they may be startling, make sense rationally, right? So the real conspiracy theories that we're debunking one of the things they tend to rely on is the idea that very large numbers of people can all not only synchronize their plot to cover up the truth and create a false narrative, but they can all keep it secret while they're doing it for extended periods of time. And I really saw that with 9/11, because 9/11 was such a big event, and it made such an impact on the American psyche and on the world. And it was so complex that there were all of these sort of loose ends and complicated details that people could gish gallop you on, right? Just keep throwing stuff at you. What about this? What about Building 7? And what about the thermite? And what about the appearance of this, that, and the other thing? And the passport that was not burned at all, that was found in the rubble, and the people who knew not to come to work on that day. And it's like, well, yeah, it was a huge event. There's all sorts of loose-ended, disparate facts that don't add up to your conspiracy map if we don't have good explanations for every single one of them. It's very often that burden of proof fallacy, or even the argument from ignorance fallacy, right? Where it's like people, the argument from ignorance, the easiest example is creationists, right?
Oh, I don't see how we could get a bacteria turning into an animal and growing a human eye. I don't understand how this is possible. Therefore it's not possible.
Yeah. Or they say to you, how did the universe begin? Well, the Big Bang. Well, what as best we know, based on the current models of inflation, probably a Big Bang. Kind of wild, but that's what the evidence shows, and we don't fully understand it. Well, what happened before the Big Bang? I don't know. Well, then you can't argue against God. God must have done it, right? So if I can point to a place where there is an ignorance or a lack of a complete answer, then my placeholder fits. So whether your placeholder is God or there's a secret cabal of satanic reptilian blood drinkers, like in either case, it doesn't work. Now, there may be a God and there may be a secret cabal of reptilian blood drinkers, but you don't have evidence for it if you bring up something that I don't have, a completely fleshed out evidence-based answer for.
We're really going down a side rabbit hole here. Speaking of rabbit holes, and speaking of, but I was reading about how obviously the universe is expanding, and the galaxies are getting further and further apart from each other, and that I forget what it is, like in 100 billion years, we will not be able to see the light from other galaxies. And cosmologists in 100 billion years, if that's the right number, are only going to be able to see the galaxy, and they'll have to be building their entire models of the universe based on only what they can see.
Mm.
So you wonder what we've already lost. I mean, we can't see through, uh, we can't see before the cosmic
Mm-hmm.
microwave background, although
Yeah.
they're trying now with gravity waves. But like, there's a whole bunch of knowledge that's probably just lost to us. You know,
Yes.
we don't know what it is, and we'll never be able to figure it out. And it, at some level, I'm okay not knowing. Like, yeah, the
Yeah.
universe started, probably, and we don't know exactly what happened, and that's just okay. Why would we expect our brains, which evolved on the African savanna,
Mm-hmm.
to be able to comprehend quantum physics, quantum gravity, or whatever the hell the next crazy theory is,
Mm-hmm.
to understand the origins of the universe? Why would we expect to be able to understand that?
Yeah, so it's in a way, yeah, we are going down rabbit holes, and
Mm.
you could reel us back in anytime you like. But I feel like part of what you're gesturing towards is that there has been no evolutionary utility
Mm.
to understanding, things of magnitude that don't actually directly
Yeah.
impact our survival needs. And so it's a very recent turning of the wheel of human consciousness that we've been able to start to examine these questions and think about them and build instruments that give us access to data about them. And they remain very, very hard to wrap our heads around. And I think it's in a way, sort of prior to that, sits the reality that uh, reason and evidence are very, very new developments, and we still have brains that are prone to all sorts of incorrect ways of perceiving things, just as side effects of how we evolved, or as blind spots in how we evolved. And so it's a very interesting thing that you're pointing out. As as the universe continues expanding, we lose all access to all sorts of data, right? So it's very easy for me to imagine a time in the not too distant future when there are conspiracy theorists, they probably exist already, but who are saying, well, you can't see anything beyond a certain distance. So that was all made up, right? That was all part of a plot to make us think that there was something so much bigger than maybe our current galaxy. So it hits me in an interesting place because it has to do with questions of knowledge, and so much of this topic of conspirituality, conspiracy theories in general, uh, sort of ways of thinking about knowledge that are inherently spiritual or revelatory. So much of it turns on, well, on what basis are you claiming knowledge, right? And then how does that shape your worldview? How does that shape the way you interact with what's actually happening? And so we have this big real-time experiment now that we're all in the midst of, where it's like, okay, this is what happens when we're all facing a global pandemic and incredible disorientation and anxiety.
And have
And so you
social
get to
media for
see,
the first time in human
oh my
history.
God, yeah, yeah. So we have this giant meme generating, self-reinforcing algorithmic box that we're all inside of together.
You are masterful because you've managed to drag me back. After giving me permission to drag the conversation back, you managed to drag it back from the Big Bang and 100 billion years in the future to one of the things I wanted to ask you about, which is
Entirely accidental.
uh, masterful, denying it all. Uh, this idea of perceiving the world and making connections where some don't necessarily exist.
Mm-hmm.
Apophenia. Uh, or do you call it apophenia? Is that the correct
I have
pronunciation?
no idea what the
Oh,
correct pronunciation is. It's a word I've only ever seen written.
okay.
Yeah.
Could you talk about that? Because you did a recent piece on conspirituality about that, and I
Yeah.
think that's a really useful concept, especially when people are being told to, do your own research, and
Yeah.
then being given what seems to be the entirety of knowledge on the internet, but really is the rabbit hole that the algorithms have decided that that's going to enable those people or encourage those people to spend more time on those
Mm-hmm.
social media
Mm-hmm.
platforms.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, even and I'm not being at all critical here, but the fact that the way the sentence comes out is that the algorithms have decided, right? So we have this tendency to perceive agency, and I think that one of the fascinating, really difficult things to navigate about our current situation, whether we're talking about social media or QAnon or the intersection of the two, is that my hunch is that a lot of it is it's sort of the Darwin's excellent sort of dangerous idea, I think Dan Dennett calls it, that if you have enough of the right elements in place, the appearance of design emerges, but without a mind behind it, right? So I think it's the same thing, say, with algorithms. Even though we can talk about how they serve a function in terms of generating income and in terms of keeping people engaged and mining them for their data, but so much of what has happened with conspiracy theories over the last 18 months, I think it's a feedback loop that's self-reinforcing and self-escalating. And part of that is it exploits our innate tendency. And I think, by the way, that tendency exists along a kind of spectrum. I imagine that one day through neuroscience, we might actually understand how that spectrum functions, right? That people are more or less susceptible to things like patternicity and epiphania or epiphenia. And so epiphania, as I pronounce it, I think, is a concept from Klaus Conrad, I think coined in 1958, who was a psychiatrist. And it stands in contrast to the term epiphany, right?
Okay.
So epiphany originally had a religious connotation to it, that you were somehow struck by some moment of religious revelation, as we've touched on so far. But over time, it's come to mean something a little bit more secular in terms of an inspired breakthrough moment where you realize the classic one is Archimedes yelling "Eureka!" Right? He realizes he's struggling with this problem of how to make sense of a mathematical theorem, and it suddenly comes to him, and he yells "Eureka!" So the story goes. Einstein would supposedly puzzle over some problem he was trying to solve, and then go for a long walk or take a long bath. And I think there's references to him talking about in the shapes of the bubbles in the bathtub. As he let his mind wander, he would go, "Oh, it's this thing," right? Same with the probably untrue apocryphal tale of the apple falling on the head of Newton. So this phenomenon of the mind functioning in such a way that out of left field comes the realization. And the important part then is that the realization turns out to be true.
Right.
And this is where scientific thinking, I think, is so valuable, right? Because everyone has intuitive epiphanies. They're wrong a huge amount of the time. And if you're a scientist, or if you're influenced by scientific thinking, then you know that intuition is a starting point. Epiphanies are hypotheses, right? They're not endpoints. If your epiphanic hypothesis turns out to be true, that's awesome. But you've got to then put it through the process and find out if it's true. And you also have to take it out of your solipsistic, self-conviction and let other people examine it, right? And I love the example you gave. I found the example you gave about jiu-jitsu really, really interesting, right? Because if you come up with a sequence of moves that you believe is an answer to a particular attack that someone else is trying on you, then you test it out, right? And so there's an interesting scientific flavor to that. And I've often, my father is a competitive chess player, and I've often thought of jiu-jitsu and chess, as I've learned more about jiu-jitsu, as being sort of related, right? That you're thinking multiple moves ahead, you're trying different strategies, there are openings, there are end positions you're trying to get to. So going through the process of discovering if your epiphany is true, I think, is the important missing step that a lot of people who are doing their own research don't, adequately understand or hold themselves sort of accountable to. In terms of the Klaus Conrad concept of apophenia, it's something he noticed in the early stages of schizophrenia, that you could tell that someone was starting to have the symptomology of that disease process taking place in the brain, because the way they were thinking started to be characterized by perceiving meaningful connections between things that actually weren't there. And it has since been something that people have sort of said, oh, this also applies to conspiracy reasoning. And there's a guy named Reed Berkowitz who is a game developer who last year wrote a fairly influential article detailing how he saw QAnon as being something
Was this
that
the article where he
exploited
talked
people.
about accidentally leaving clues in a room
Yeah.
Talk about that. That's a fantastic, like that just is the metaphor of the decade.
Yeah, I don't have it all like readily
Huh.
accessible in my mind because I read it a long time ago, many months ago. But essentially he talked about, as a game developer, realizing that you could that if you had various clues that would sort of like a choose your own adventure situation, right? That would lead you down different pathways based on how you responded to what you were seeing within the game environment. Uh, Sometimes there would be accidents in the
Mm.
creation of the game and the programming of the game where you would have clues that led nowhere. But that, interestingly, I think this is the observation, that players would become obsessed with that
Yeah.
actually being really important, right? That this thing,
I think you read this first,
yeah,
but I've read this last.
more recently. So tell me, yeah,
And so I think there's some room, some negligible room, and I don't know, they're going through some basement, and he'd left some garbage on the floor in the game, right? So there's like a rock, there's a stick, and it formed a triangle, and it
ah,
pointed at the wall.
that's
So
right,
instead of continuing down the hallway with the main story arc, the test players would stop and start trying to chip through this wall.
yeah,
And there was nothing behind the wall. And he
yeah.
immediately was going, man, I should have put something behind that wall. But there was nothing behind the wall. And so they derailed the whole entire game as the players, I think it was in the test environment, were trying to chisel through this wall because of some random placement of rocks on the floor. Because rocks, or garbage or whatever it was in the digital environment were just scattered accidentally into a
Yeah,
triangle
so
shaped pattern.
it turns out that whatever you do, things end up making certain shapes, and
Yeah.
sometimes those shapes seem to be important. There's an amazing episode of the Radio Lab podcast called Stochasticity.
I've not listened to that one.
It's an incredible episode, and it talks about how there if you look carefully enough, you will find absolutely unintentional, coincidental things wherever you look. If you just look, if you look through enough instances of any event, you will find coincidences that seem to us absolutely impossible that it could be random. And this is a fascinating thing, that we have an idea of what randomness means, which actually is a patterned idea of randomness, right? It's that everything will appear to be completely disconnected. So for example, if we flipped coins 50 times, and then we made up one list of head and tails results, and then we put the actual head and tails results next to it, and we showed them to people. Most people, if in our made up list we had head tails, every now and again two heads, every now and again two tails, or three, but for the most part we alternated in a pattern that seems to us intuitively to be random, they would choose the false list over the real list, because the real list of 50 coin flips will occasionally have five heads in a row.
Yeah.
It'll have all sorts of things that people go, well, that couldn't possibly be random. And so in the case of the video game example you're giving, how could those things be in a perfect triangle? That must mean something. Meanwhile, the game developers are going, oh, we didn't even realize we had put that there. And that it makes this shape, and that the shape points toward the wall. And so what Berkowitz, I think, was saying was that, and certainly this fits with my perception of what happened with QAnon over time, is that as it unfolded and as people presented their interpretations, because there sprang up a whole sort of cottage industry of YouTube bakers, they called themselves, who were interpreting the Q drops as meaning various things. The whole thing just takes on a life of its own. Again, it's kind of algorithmic. It's an algorithmic accident that there's this feedback loop, and so the guy who was posting his Q, or the different people who were, most likely it was Ron Watkins, it seems, could just keep feeding back into that and playing off of how people were interpreting it and what the events were. And so I think Reed Berkowitz was saying that there is a gamification that was happening there that exploited this quality that he noticed? Maybe you can say more, having read it more recently.
I think we just want to see patterns.
Yep.
And it's I mean, the gamification of it is separate from, or is in addition to the human tendency to see patterns. We're not the first people to talk about how the human mind tends to see patterns where none exist, right? If we hear a branch breaking in the forest, we think saber-toothed tiger, because the evolutionary implications of if it is a saber-tooth, we better know about it. If it isn't, so I overreacted a bit. So we are desperate. And before there was sort of a formal approach to understanding knowledge, and we'll call that science, where we're actually trying to disprove our own hypotheses, right? We're trying not to fool ourselves, as I think Feynman once said, we are the easiest people to fool, and trying to build a system of knowledge based and for deducing knowledge based around the supposition that it's easy to fool ourselves. The best we had was pattern recognition. Hey, I don't know, I accidentally stabbed a goat in this field, and then the rains came and I had the best barley harvest ever. Okay, well, let's try it again. Holy crap, there's 2 good barley harvests in a year, or in 2 years. How frequent were barley harvests in the Middle East? I'll go twice a year. That makes
me... let's do it.
And before too long, you've got a pattern. But the gamification, I'm trying to remember his central point. It's kind of getting... I mean, people post... If in response to Donald Trump tweeting covfefe, or whatever it was he tweeted there in the middle of the night, if you have a theory, and I don't know, let's come up with a crazy theory that the C stands for cosmos, and ofefe is this ancient Egyptian word for destruction, the imminent destruction of the cosmos. And I have a different... that wasn't actually one. And I have a different theory, and we put them both out on Facebook, and people like your theory more, then your theory kind of wins. It gets more points, it gets more likes. And then it becomes, so these competing ideas rise to the top and get accepted into canon. I wish I had a better example of what happened to those covfefe tweets, that covfefe tweet, because that was all that anyone talked about for a couple of days.
Yeah. What did it really mean? What did it really mean? It's kind of like do you remember the 5 jihadis thing?
No.
The as part of the whole set of ways in which QAnon sort of made incursions into the outside world, this is a particularly ludicrous one. James Comey responded to a hashtag that was going around on Twitter, which was 5 jobs I've had. Hashtag 5 jobs I've had, right?
Yes.
And so he responded by, he's just playing along, having fun on Twitter. He listed the 5 jobs he's had, like many thousands of people had done in response to that hashtag. And there was a QAnon baker who decided that 5 jobs I've had actually stood for 5 jihadis for some reason. And that the first letter of each of the jobs stood for, was a GVCS. And so the first one was like grocery clerk or something, right? And so then just randomly looked on the internet for what those initials could mean, and found Grass Valley Charter High School. There was an H in there too. Grass Valley Charter High School, and which is a little high school in California, in a little town of like 1,200 people or something, and decided that their fundraising event that was happening the following weekend was going to be the site of a false flag operation that James Comey was planning, that he decided to tweet about to sort of notify the people who were involved.
As one does, like a Bond villain.
Yeah, and so immediately all the QAnon people started calling the FBI, calling the cops, calling the actual high school. Ended up getting the event canceled because maybe something terrible is going to happen on this day, which is all folded in then to the QAnon conspiracy that if they can have a false flag event, then they can take away our guns. If they can take away our guns, then they can start to institute the New World Order, and that's what COVID is really all about.
Why don't we do this live? I've got my phone here. Give me
Cool.
5 letters. Let's see what happens. Give me
Okay,
5 random
let's
letters.
choose 5 letters. T, F.
Actually,
J.
what were the 5 jobs that you've had?
Oh, 5 jobs I've had. Okay, let's do it that way. So, publicity, yoga, guitar teaching, massage, writing.
All right. PYGMW. Okay, so we get to the Facebook page for the Pourfendeur de Cannelle au Québec page on Facebook, but it's a YouTube video. All right, so we're just blowing the doors off your film documentaire Censure en France, Planet of the Humans.
Wow.
So clearly we have to go somewhere with this.
Okay.
And the first ad that we're seeing is in French.
Okay.
So clearly the overlords are French. We've now managed to... okay, I'm going to skip ads. Okay, and we have tracked down the next overlord, and as you notice, he's speaking in French. I think this is testable for anybody. Like, pick 5... pick any... I probably shouldn't be doing this, but people listening, pick any 5 letters. Type them into Google. Google will give you some kind of answer.
Yeah.
And then if you wanted to connect, it's like, what is 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon? I bet you can get from whatever result there to the moon landing is fake in 3 steps.
Yeah. I remember about 15 years ago moving in kind of crunchy granola spiritual circles, and there was this great book that had come out. I forget the name of the author. He had written a previous book that I really liked that was kind of an allegorical, mythological story of spiritual awakening, like was happening a lot in the 90s. And his new book, I thought, I'm curious what this book will be about. And a friend of mine had it, and there was a group who were hanging out together, and they pulled it out. And what the book was, the entire book was about how if you added up, it was numerology. If you added up the alphabet values of your name and the place you were born in, and your date of birth, that this book then could tell you everything about your personality, everything about what psychological and spiritual work you had to do, and what your destiny was going to be, and what kind of partner you were going to be married to. And at the time, I just thought, this is so completely ridiculous. I'm so disappointed. But the group I was with were very excited by this. And that's the sort of overlap with the conspiracy thinking and the more sort of spiritual patternicity that you're referring to. And to go back to the patternicity and your example of you hear a branch snap and you assume it must be a predator. Part of what you were getting at there is that the false negative is the dangerous thing, right? So the false positive. So the false negative is, it's probably just a bunny or the wind. I'm not going to bother reacting to it. And maybe 1 time out of 10, you become dinner. The false positive is, oh my God, what if it's a predator? We all jump up and grab our weapons, and it turns out nothing to worry about. Well, there's no downside to that. All that's happened is you've had an arousal response, and everything's turned out to be okay. And so then you go back to business as usual. So there's an unintended side effect, right? In evolution, they call it a spandrel. There's an unintended side effect that means we are the descendants of other humans who looked for patterns even when they weren't there in a pattern-seeking activity that was tied to a fear of death. And I have a hunch that, again, people exist along a spectrum where some people are more finely tuned or more compelled by seeking out patterns in that particular way. And at the far end of that spectrum, I do think you have psychiatric diagnoses and maybe certain neurological conditions. And at this
schizophrenia for sure. I don't know about others, but I've watched a couple of people descend into schizophrenia, like reasonably normal teenagers, and then right around the end of teenagehood, in one case with a whole lot of drugs, in the other case with no drugs at all, descend into this insane pattern-seeking behavior. Like, actually, my uncle, he's dead now, but I mean, very intelligent man. Intelligence is nothing to do with with your resistance to any of this stuff. But don't go visit that valley in Switzerland. Karl Marx passed through there on his way to some meeting. That's an evil valley. Like, there's a dude who had like high degrees in mathematics. Like, he'd done advanced calculus, and now he's connecting. He's reading in this book about Karl Marx. He's reading in this book about geomancy. He's reading in this book about the geology of Switzerland. And this is an evil valley that you shouldn't go visit.
Yeah. Yes. Somehow it adds up to that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I knew several people who became schizophrenic in their 20s as well. Some personally, and some just because I lived in Venice Beach, and I would go to different coffee shops, and I lived in a funky little apartment with an alleyway behind it. So I interacted with people, and I was a friendly kind of neo hippie dude who would talk to people randomly and sort of give them the benefit of the doubt. So I've witnessed that descent into schizophrenic ideation as well, and it's really disturbing, and it's really fascinating. And one of the most noteworthy things about it for me was sort of recognizing that the person who is inside it, it's impossible. It's like the water that they're swimming in, right? Yeah. It's even more impossible than the most convinced neurotypical person, right? It's even deeper than that. That the way that they're thinking has turned into this delusional process that they're utterly convinced of and excited by and terrified by and compelled to take action in response to. And that is a really wild thing. But to be really clear, because people often hear this the wrong way, I'm certainly not saying that all spiritual people are crazy. I'm not saying that all conspiracy theorists are crazy in a sort of demeaning way, right? In an insulting way.
No, some of them are just swimming entirely in a data. They're swimming in their data, whether that's Fox News plus One America plus Facebook rabbit hole. They're making rational decisions based on completely incorrect data. They're making health-based decisions based off of COVID is 99.999999997% survivable. If that truly were a fact, then what we've gone through for the last year is idiotic. If this, then that. So they're making rational decisions just based on incorrect information. But you're talking about people who have gone further than that. It's even left in an open environment. They're still making their own connections.
Well, yeah, and I want to come back to what you just said about the data points, but the spectrum. I'm suggesting that there's a spectrum, and that there is a pattern-seeking way of making sense of the world that is beneficial, that can at times be accurate, that can discover important new revelations about the world, but that if tweaked in the right ways, or if genetically susceptible, can, through various processes, some of which may be cultural and some of which may be biological, be very similar to what we see in certain kinds of psychiatric diagnoses, because it's all we're all working with the same brain and the same tendencies, right? So in the same way that a hallucination is a hijacking of your visual apparatus, right? To think that you're seeing something, but it's not really there. In terms of the data points, it brings up another really difficult thing, which is that in the information age, in the age of the internet, whereas, as you said, we have all of the knowledge of the world kind of at our fingertips, it's incredibly overwhelming. And it's incredibly, I think that one of the most difficult things cognitively about the pandemic is that so much of it's abstract, right? Because we are able to see what's happening in India and Iran and Italy. We are able to get early warnings as it rippled across the globe towards North America. We are able to see numbers on how many people have been infected and died. But if it's not affecting your life directly, like you said, and I've talked to so many people like this as well, who say, well, I don't know anyone, and I don't know anyone who knows anyone who's died from COVID. So So there's almost a scientific way of thinking that people are trying to apply, where they're like, yeah, I hear this theory, I hear this hypothesis about what's really going on in the world, but it's hard for me to trust it because I have no direct experience of it. And I've heard this fact that, it's 99.9% that I wouldn't die from it anyway. So why are we going through all of this, right? And it's not, if you're charitable, it's not hard to see how people are arriving at those conclusions.
I like how you're talking about the, I don't know, the predisposition towards seeing patterns, well, apophenia, being on a spectrum. I mean, humans exist on a spectrum, like immune system. If you have no immune system
Yep.
in the natural world, you're going to die. Like pre-modern medicine, you're going to die.
Mm-hmm.
If your immune system is really, 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 really strong, you're going to die because it's going to attack you, right? It's going to, those are, called immune conditions where your body starts attacking yourself. There is a sweet spot in the middle of the spectrum.
Mm-hmm.
And it applies to everything. I mean, if you're, I don't know, stomach acid, if you didn't have any stomach acid, you would starve to death. If your stomach acid were 100 times stronger than regular stomach acid, you would also die. I don't know where I came up with the stomach acid idea. There's a sweet spot in the middle where you've got, reasonably acidic stomach acid that'll digest the food without eating your stomach.
Yeah.
And so, pattern recognition, if you never saw any patterns at all, like, man, I've dated 18, I keep on dating these crazy women who try and stab me in my sleep, and I just don't see the connection. They're all redheads. Versus over here, man, I met a black person once and he was an asshole, therefore all black people are assholes.
Yeah.
Right? That's extreme pattern recognition. Pattern, quotes, air quotes for the people listening on audio, recognition. Somewhere in the middle is probably better than either extreme.
Yeah. So you need enough curiosity and openness to your intuition and to like coming up with creative combinations of ideas to be engaged in life, to find life meaningful, to maybe to do good things in the world, especially if you're a creative person, if you're a thinker. And at some level, just to function, as you're saying, right? If you perceive no patterns whatsoever, you'd never learn. So pattern recognition is part of how we learn from the past and part of how we predict the future. Yeah. But the pathological versions of these, as I think, I think that all forms of prophecy, that have some sort of supernatural claim behind them are a kind of pathology. They're an overactivity of they're an overactive expression of the anxiety about not knowing what's going to happen next. And so let me rely on this prophecy that comes from some sort of great beyond source. But, if you're not planning for the future, well, then you're probably your life is not going to be as good as someone who does know how to plan for the future. So yeah, somewhere in that sweet spot.
So you just mentioned the word prophecy, and I wanted to pick your brain about this. It really does seem like there's a lot of apocalyptic end of times type of thought going around nowadays. Everything from one of the people I know who's probably on the schizophrenic end of things in the last year and a half has given me about 8 different dates. June 2nd, 2019. You better watch out. Don't travel. I don't know. August 3rd, 2019. Okay. This is when it's really going to go down. And it's really like the end of days cults that, missed their day. And if they didn't all kill themselves, like in Heaven's Gate, then they immediately pivoted to another date. Yes, we got the math wrong. It's actually not June 1st. It's going to be June 15th next year. Or our belief was so strong that we managed to, avert the apocalypse. They cancel the apocalypse. But it really does seem like there's a whole lot of end times thinking when it comes to, the return of Trump, when it comes to QAnon when it comes to, this is the day that all the the pedophilic, blood drinking lizard senators get locked up.
Yeah. Yeah. The thing about it is it's everything old is new again, right? And this was the thing with QAnon, is that it managed to, I think that, along the lines of what I was saying before about a sort of algorithmic accident, as QAnon gained steam, and the roots of QAnon lie in a whole lot of previous stuff that was happening on all of those message boards, on all of those image boards, 4chan, eventually 8chan, 8kun, but 2chan, and there's a whole bunch of them that go back into the 90s, at least as far as I understand. And it's this group of people, in a way, sort of reinventing the world through this new technology. And all of that is a precursor to social media. It's a precursor to everyone being on social media. And I remember when that transition happened. I remember when Facebook was only for college kids, and then all of a sudden, all of the adults I knew were on Facebook.
Mm-hmm.
And through this online interacting, a whole new iteration of both politics and religion and personal identity and moral philosophy sort of reemerged, right? It's almost like we have these templates within our psyches, within our brains, within our cultural and social setups. And there is something about a specific kind of interaction with the new technology that ends up becoming social media that has given us ways of not only sort of re-exploring all of that activity without maybe even realizing that we're doing it, like re-exploring the history of political philosophy, for example, right? Without even realizing that we're doing it, but also what a lot of people talk about, which is the balkanizing, the echo chambers, the filter bubbles, right? That we algorithmically then get caught in, where we're just having the beliefs that we have found appealing so far, endlessly reaffirmed. I'm spacing out on where you were. That made me go there. Oh, end of times. Yeah. So the end of times prophecy stuff is not new. It's something that's been with us as long as we've had human cultures. I mean, certainly going back to ancient Sumeria, if I'm remembering stuff that I learned from Joseph Campbell, which is maybe 6,000 BC. There's this idea that there are forces of darkness and forces of light, and they're in an endless battle with one another. And that at some point in the future, there's going to be a cataclysmic event where the forces of light and the forces of darkness have a great battle. And you better fucking be on the right side if you want to be saved. And being saved has to do with a world beyond this world. And so for me, this goes back in terms of like cognitive psychology and evolution. It goes back to animism, and that all human beings were, if you go far enough back, all human beings were animists, in that we perceived some animating force behind everything in the world, right? It's almost like there's two worlds. There's the world of manifest appearances, which is, the rivers and the trees and the mountains and the animals and one another and the stars and the sun and the moon. And each of them have some sort of invisible animating spirit, so to speak, right? So I think very early on, there's some, again, this is sort of an evolutionary spandrel in terms of how our brains developed. Very early on, there's a tendency to have this dualistic thinking where we think there's a body and then there's a soul. Then the soul maybe goes on after death, because how else do you make sense of this existence? Some of that, I think, has to do with the fact that the brain has no direct access to its own processes. So we experience our brains as being an open space of mind within which experience arises. And that seems to be radically discontinuous from the body, right? Even though it's the brain, which is part of the body, doing that, there's this sense of mind that intuitively seems to be different than body. And so all of that, to me, makes us prone, and you see this across all cultures and all times, right? Prone to imagining a world beyond this world, a spirit world, a world from which everything is manifesting, some great animating presence, and there are multiple different variations on that idea. And so if
But
you
how
then
does that lead to a book of Revelations? How does that lead to Ragnarok? How does that lead to basically um, the all the Democrats getting locked up and sent to Guantanamo?
Well, yeah, and I'm being a little bit of a galaxy brain here with various theories, right? And it's just how my mind works. So bear with me, and I could be totally full of shit. But my sense is that as human brains and human culture kept evolving, the importance of empathy and the importance of cooperation in order for group survival, and then the need to create some sort of top-down control over groups, because there's tension between our instinctive drives and maybe our variations in temperament, and being able to cooperate and have empathy for one another, and sort of not transgress the rules of the tribe. That ends up coalescing into this idea that there is an invisible parent who dictates how you are to behave, who will be angry with you if you don't do what we're telling you to do, if you don't overcome your animalistic instincts. And you are going to attain to some kind of eternal life in the presence of that invisible parent if they approve of how you behave. And you are going to be punished in some kind of eternal way in the world beyond the world, right?
Sure.
And so in some iterations, I think that then gives birth to this idea that this world is going to end at some point, as all things do, right? Because we look around us and we extrapolate. And when it ends, we will go to the world beyond. And so all of life is really about this grand struggle between whichever of the different mythological figures of darkness and light are being referenced. And in each generation, there is a group of people who think we live in the end times, and it's coming soon, and you better get on board with us because we have access to the revelatory knowledge about when it's going to happen and what you need to do to prepare. And then when there are enough cultural pressures and logistical pressures within a particular time frame, I think that gets even more amplified. So at the turn of the century, people tend to get obsessed with these ideas in times of great
Y2K.
social yeah. In times of great social change, people tend to get obsessed with these ideas because there's a fear about what we're losing, and there's a sense of the unknown, and there's also a sense that people who maybe have values different than ours are taking over, and they're bringing their sort of ungodly ways to bear that we are threatened by. And so this must be an indication that the great battle is intensifying. And so with QAnon, you just, as you were describing with your friend, there's a similar pattern, and that pattern is a continuously updating new prophecy as to when the big cataclysmic event is going to happen. What you saw in the New Age community was that this then got given the flavor, the great awakening that the QAnon people were talking about got given the flavor of some kind of New Age opening of the Stargate, transition into fifth dimensional reality. So everything's going to be light and love on the other side, but there will be the appearance, the illusory appearance of some kind of great battle where terrible things will happen. But don't worry, it's all going to be for the best. And on the other side, and so there were New Age figures like this woman Lori Ladd that we've covered quite a bit, and even Christiane Northrup, who's probably even more influential. These hundreds of thousands of followers who were in the run up to the Capitol insurrection were using a lot of this kind of language, that there's going to be a battle on the earth plane, and you need to, as light workers, you need to steel yourself and set aside your judgments and don't see it as bad, because it's leading us toward this triumphant moment of breaking through to the Great Awakening. And there's a lot of historical precedent for this. So you reference Heaven's Gate, where this group for 20 years, most of them had been in the cult for that long, 15 to 20 years, were all living in a house together and committed suicide together because they believed that behind the Hale-Bopp comet was a spaceship that was arriving to finally take them away and onto their destiny. And the thing that's most chilling about the Heaven's Gate story is that a large number of those who willingly went along, and willingly is a loaded concept when you're talking about cults, but who went along with the suicide gave exit interviews where, there's hours of footage you can find where they talked about how happy they were to be doing this and that their whole life had been leading up to this moment.
I suppose if you're designing a cult, it's a little bit safer. If you and I were to design a cult, we'd put a couple features, an end times cult. We would put a couple features in. We would say the end times are soon, 1 to 10 years. We're not going to say the end times are 350 years from now, because then people will say, cool, I hope my grandkids get on board. I'm just going to do whatever I want, right?
That would be like you'd be shooting yourself in the foot if it was any time outside of your own lifetime, right?
Yeah, it'd be the cult would be selected against in a Darwinian sense. What else would we put into it? It's a big risk to say all this is going to happen in the outside world, whether it's like a Turner Diary type of revolution or something like that. Because if it doesn't happen, it's pretty obvious it didn't happen. But I mean, the Heaven's Gate people, who's to say they didn't go to the comet, right?
Exactly. There's a survivor who left the group at some point, who has been interviewed at fairly regular intervals about, well, what do you think about it now? And that person still, even though they left, they still have that perspective that, I left because it was my destiny to be able to tell people about what happened and about how I think it was Do and Ta, whatever they called the two leaders.
Applewhite.
Marshall Applewhite, that they were the incarnations of Jesus and the Buddha or whomever, that they were the most enlightened beings of our time. And I do believe that they did what they needed to do and they did the right thing, and they're living on in the great extraterrestrial other world.
Survivors of Jonestown, Jim Jones's Jonestown, they do talk about the tremendous amount of love they felt within that cult environment. And I mean, I don't know if they felt regret at missing out on the taking the Kool-Aid and the mass suicide that happened in the jungles later, but it did really create a sense of acceptance, I think, for those people, and a sense of love. And maybe I think you guys have talked about it especially during quarantine, when people were at home and separated from their loved ones and their family and their friends and their coworkers. A lot of people were profoundly lonely and found some kind of companionship and acceptance and some kind of surrogate for love in these online conspiracy groups.
I mean, it's an amplified version of what was happening anyway, right? So from the message boards through to what we get with social media, you have this phenomenon of people seeking community online, and I've done it a lot too, and I'm sure you have, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. Having these kinds of relationships based on shared interests through the screen, and then that starting to turn into based on perhaps shared politics or shared religion or shared conspiracy theories. And then you have this thing where people are stuck at home and they're spending too much time on their screens and they're filled with anxiety, and they already have a predisposition towards this kind of thinking. I think the most important thing to not lose sight of, whether we're talking about conspiracy theories or cults or the intersection of the two, is that it does fill all kinds of really important needs. That the need for belonging, the need to feel like you're part of a group who has a mission, the need to feel like you're the ones who really get it, or you're on the side of the good, or that and this is where I think a lot of spiritual people are very susceptible, that you have access to special hidden knowledge that the normal people, the mainstream people, the unenlightened people, the people who are still asleep and haven't taken the red pill, don't know about, and that you're on the inside, and because you're special. So it feeds needs for belongingness and love and connection and shared purpose, but
and
also
secret knowledge,
which is sort of a narcissistic need, right? That I am this really special person who has access to knowledge within a very special group, who are going to be the chosen ones who changed the world. And you'll see when the prophesied event finally happens, then you'll all get it, and you'll realize that you were calling us idiots, but we're the ones who really know.
Yeah, you're talking about the kind of being the possessor of hidden spiritual knowledge. There's a very, very easy comparative there for hidden secular knowledge. I know that Big Pharma is lying. These idiots don't see that Big Pharma has lied in the past and they're lying now. I know that Dr. Fauci is in league with the Chinese government and the World Health Organization and the CDC and the Public Health Organization of Albania in this giant conspiracy. It's not spiritual knowledge, but it's kind of fake political knowledge, or it's fake. I'm going to label it as fake. I'm going to judge it. I've been doing a lot of judging of fake science.
Well, that's where you're going wrong, you see. You need to be completely non-judgmental.
Yeah.
And then everything will get better. Yeah, it has a similar flavor in terms of the type of knowledge claims, right? And the ways of thinking about things, and also the impenetrability. So the thing that's really fascinating about all of this is that people who get sucked into conspiracy theories, and I noticed this a lot with spirituality as well over the years, they will often adopt the position that they're the true skeptics.
Yeah.
Right? That those of us who trust science, well, we're not being skeptical enough because we think that science is somehow a perfect path to knowledge that can't be corrupted. So goes their story. And yet they are the ones who are really savvy to how science is this limiting worldview. It's all bought and paid for. It's none of it can really be trusted. And they'll hammer that really hard until, if they're spiritual, they might then start talking about how quantum physics actually validates everything they're saying. Right? And if they're not as spiritual and they're more in the conspiracy domain, they'll hit that really hard until they dump, 15 PubMed links to scientific studies that supposedly prove that vaccine causes autism or something like this. So it's the selective quote unquote skepticism about science, unless they're drawing on pseudoscience, or they've found the three contrarian experts who claim various things about vaccines or the pandemic, masks, etc. Then they're all in on science, and this person obviously hasn't been corrupted because they're saying the thing. So it's not based on standards of evidence; it's based on whether or not it fits the motivated reasoning.
I had Dr. Kat Wallace on the podcast, and I sent her a link that I found. And it was published in some super low quality scientific journal. Then it got retracted. I don't know how it got published, but it was explaining the physics of how 5G radio signals create pentagonal and hexagonal holes in the nuclear membrane.
Oh my God.
Through which the
nanobots?
No, there were no nanobots in this theory, but how COVID spontaneously self-assembles through these holes, right? The 30,000 base sequence. It's just, I bet that's science. I mean, guess what? It got retracted as soon as and it was in a pay to play journal, and then it got retracted by that pay to play journal, and it's the worst scientific paper I have ever looked at in my life. But here's a publication in one of your blessed journals.
Yeah.
Just, okay, well, you got one over here and you've got 85,000 publications here. We're just going to focus on this one here
and this is part of the phenomenon of doing your own research, right? That people who've maybe who have very little knowledge or training in science, and I have no training in science, but people who come to this place of going, okay, I'm going to do my own research. I'm going to go to PubMed, or I'm going to follow these links that I'm getting from all sorts of questionable sources. And then if I see something that fits the template of looking like a scientific study, or maybe even of being a scientific study that has some legitimacy to it, then I'm going to cherry pick that data. And there's this lack of understanding that people who follow the science actually are looking at a wide range of, that the scientific process in and of itself is one of continuously examining the data and revising your point of view. But that's completely lost.
Yeah. Well, there are these archive sites. There are these pre-publication sites, right? If you and I
Yep.
write a paper
Yep.
before it gets peer reviewed, we can publish it,
Yep.
and it's published. Like MedRxiv
Mm-hmm.
is a good example.
Yep.
But there's a giant disclaimer at the top saying like this, these studies have not been peer reviewed. Nobody's taken a look at it. Nobody's taken a look to see whether the statistics are completely flawed. Nobody's taken a look at, whether this is an obvious forgery. Nobody's taken a look if the interpretations are correct. And so a lot of what gets circulated, like I've spent time on those servers and I found some interesting stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But you do have to go, okay, this has only got like, I don't know, a 60% chance of being semi-correct.
Yeah.
But then not inevitably, but most of the time when somebody sends you science, they're either sending you to one of these not yet peer-reviewed papers, or they're sending you to a YouTube video. And I'm here to tell the world that scientists don't actually publish their stuff on YouTube. That's not how it's done.
What about LinkedIn?
Yeah. Well, whatever Brett Weinstein and Eric Weinstein do, it's the opposite.
Yeah, it's the opposite of that. Or I think it was Geert van den Bossche, the guy who posted an article to LinkedIn, and that then became the big, this guy's the whistleblower about how vaccines are actually going to create the end of the world because they will create vaccine escape. It's like, wait, this is from LinkedIn, okay, and has his PhD in veterinary medicine, but did work in an administrative capacity at some vaccine companies. Okay, so this is the guy.
Well, we've talked about human beings existing on a spectrum, and something like 1% of people are schizophrenic. Like that's not. So there are people with. Let's say that scientists, let's say that doctors are less prone than regular people to be schizophrenic. They're less likely to make it through that training. So let's say instead of 1 in 100, it's 1 in 1,000.
Yeah.
Even 1 in 10,000. There's, what is it? I think it's 1 million doctors in North America. I don't know if that includes Mexico or not. You're gonna find, full on schizophrenic, and that's just focusing on one psychological condition.
Yeah,
there are other things. There's grift. There's other mental illnesses.
Yeah, I mean, even if we pull back from schizophrenia, right? If we just come a few clicks to the left on the spectrum into people who just have a hyper activated tendency to see patterns that are not there, or have some kind of psychological motivation to be a crusading advocate of some kind of alternative point of view, and then there's the financial motivation too. Yeah,
I mean, Dr. Mercola sells a whole lot of alternate immunity boosting supplements. So.
Yeah, and it brings up an interesting question too when we start to talk about grift. That I find a lot of people. There seems to be a pragmatic point of view that a lot of people have in analyzing this stuff, that it doesn't matter whether the proponent, like you talk about Mercola, right, or RFK Jr. is another great example. It doesn't matter if they believe what they're saying or not, and I get that from a pragmatic point of view, where they're like, well, they're saying these things, and this is the effect it has on the world. But I find myself very unsatisfied with that, because I'm always curious, and I actually really think it does matter whether or not the person is deliberately and dishonestly enacting a grift.
So who's saying gain. It doesn't matter for the conspiracists or the people who are trying to follow the mainstream science?
People like us who are analyzing it, right? It's having a sort of cultural or intellectual skeptical analysis of these kinds of figures. Very often, I'm familiar with the point of view that says, well, we can't psychoanalyze them. We can't know what's in their heart. Why would we even speculate on whether they believe what they're saying or not? And yet I have this gnawing sense of like, well, but it matters to me. I know I can't have psychic insight about it, but I have less of a condemning, judgmental attitude towards someone who genuinely thinks, they believe with all their heart that vaccines are dangerous for babies and children, let alone adults. And and that they have to dedicate themselves to trying to spread the word about that. I have less judgmental condemnation for them than for someone who is just building their supplement empire and loves the attention and either doesn't really know or knows that they're full of shit, you know?
Yeah, I would agree with you. I'm going to
Yeah.
cast more judgment on the deliberate grifter
Mm-hmm.
than the true fanatic. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
I think they're both dangerous in society, but I pass more judgment on one than the other.
Yeah.
Um, so, Julian,
Yes.
we pimped the Conspirituality podcast. I think
Yep.
it's fantastic. I would encourage people uh, to subscribe. I would encourage people to become supporters. How do people, and I'm guessing you would say the same thing,
Yeah.
uh, how do people follow you?
Well, I would invite people most to follow Conspirituality. That's where I'm doing most of my work. So we have on Instagram Conspirituality Pod, and then we have the conspirituality.net is the website. You can find me, Julian Walker, Mark with a C, on social media. So come and check out what I'm doing there. Anyone who's interested in kind of what I would describe as a more integrated kind of psychology and science informed approach to things like yoga and meditation, you can find me at julianwalkeryoga.com as well. Yeah.
So that Mark with a C as opposed to
Mm-hmm.
Mark with a K.
Correct.
How does that change your outcome if you run that through the numerological calculator?
I'm not sure, but I bet the C is more advantageous.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's actually a pretty good place to end.
All right.
So, is there anything that you want to add? Is there anything you want to subtract?
No, I don't think so. No.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
It's always a pleasure, and really, sincerely, thank you again from the bottom of my heart for what you guys are doing.
Absolutely. I had great fun talking with you today, Stefan, and thank you.